Okay, so please take place, and we will open this plenary session on unheard voices. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this plenary session. Maybe for the introduction, what do we mean by unheard voices? Or maybe you were wondering, as we do. So the question is, from whom come these voices, and by whom they are not heard somehow? And that's something that we will decipher a bit during the plenary. So the concern today is related to the way migration research accounts for or can make visible and contribute to the empowerment of the marginalized communities or the dispossessed. It is clearly related to different influences that stem from the history from below, from circa 1970s, the people's history, where history of the disenfranchised and the outsiders, the masses that were not heard into the mainstream history, have been told. And that's a type of concern that would be also taken on board by the subaltern studies or the post-colonial and decolonial studies as well. So we are digging into this context. How social science and migration research can reflect the standpoints and the experiences of these communities, the dispossessed, and not only as observers or commentators for the purpose to reveal or to make visible the dynamics of subordination, but also to, in close connection with the communities. That is, not to speak about the communities, but to let the communities speak as well. That's the main issue that we want to understand. So to talk about that, I'm very happy to welcome three distinguished speakers. Aïssatou Mbodj-Pouye, which is an anthropologist from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, which is here, located. She is in her research place at the Institut des Mondes Africains. She has conducted a fieldwork in Mali, Senegal, and France. Her last book, An Address in Paris, Emplacement, Bureaucracy, and Belonging in West African Hostels, was published by Columbia University Press in 2023 in the Black Lives in the Diaspora series. Her book combines ethnography and archival work to approach a typically French housing system, which is the migrant hostel, which has offered housing to male migrants for decades, and now it's more or less dismantled, or at least that change of destination. At the intersection of the study of migration and the anthropology of text, media, and vernacular forms of expression, our current project examines how immigration is debated in the region of Kay in Mali through the study of a radio station and its archives of sound. Then we have Carolina Delphine Maciel, who is a researcher and professor in postgraduate department at the State University of Campinas, Unicamp in Brazil. She's trained in history, audiovisual, and memory studies. She has been also working as a director of film documentaries. She's the president of the Refugees Chair Sergio Vieira de Mello at Unicamp and coordinator of Memoria's COVID-19 platform. She is international fellow at the Institut Convergence Migration, so part of the family. And she is the former coordinator of the research center at Cochrane Unicamp and former president of Brazilian Oral History Association. And then Sara Prestianni, who is the advocacy director for Euromed Rights, a network that you may know, is representing 68 organizations and in 30 countries in the Mediterranean region. She's working from the Brussels office since 2020. Since 2024, she is doing research and advocacy work about migrations and European policies in the Mediterranean and Sahelian regions. She has contributed to several reports on human rights violation at the internal and external borders of this area. She has published with Michel Agier, Je me suis réfugié là, Bord de route en exil in 2011, and contributed to collective book A World of Camps, published in 2014, and to the Atlas of Migrants in Europe, A Critical Geography of Migration Politics, which has been published in 2009, 2012, and 2021. So, without further ado, I'm introducing the way we're going to proceed. So we will have 3 sequences where each of our presenters will reflect on the question that we'll ask. And so the first sequence will be on your general ideas on how migration and ethnic and racial studies are accounting for the voices of the dispossessed, disadvantaged communities, and maybe your reaction to the concept of unheard voices. Does it speak to you? And maybe to begin, Aïssatou, if you want to open the floor.
Yes, so thank you very much, Patrick, for this introduction. And I would like also to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. So before I come to migrant communities, I'd like to suggest that we also bear in mind the issue of unheard academic voices. This is a topic which has already been touched upon at several points during the conference. I was in panel this morning when it was discussed, and it was also the topic of many other presentations. But I would like to relate our conversation on how to connect with migrant communities to this topic. And I think both concerns are part of this wider task of decentering migration studies, which is pretty much ahead of us. So a few words on that, and I'll be speaking from my point of view of a researcher. As Patrick mentioned, I'm based here on campus, and I work in an African Studies Center. The collective task of developing a culture of curiosity and attention for the production of scholarly knowledge on migration outside Europe and US academia is urgent. It requires efforts to engage with work produced sometimes outside academic circuits we are more familiar with, sometimes kept in libraries and not online, and in many languages. So it also means, obviously, spending time discussing our findings with our colleagues based in the Global South, in my case, in African universities, abandoning extractive practices of traveling only to collect data without paying a visit to our colleagues working on the ground, colleagues who are experts and not assistants. And more generally, paying attention to the asymmetries that are built into our academic institutions and practices so that such exchanges can take place in the best condition possible. And I'm thinking of the many colleagues who couldn't come because they had no visa or couldn't pay the conference fees, and we are definitely missing their voices. So I just wanted to begin with this reminder, because I think that when we build academic spaces which are truly diverse and decentered, we might also connect differently with migrant communities. So now to the notion of unheard voices, which I find interesting for all the questions it generates. I don't believe that there are people out there who are silent and who would awaiting us to make their voices heard. So for me, the key question is, why are there voices that we do not easily hear? Through what processes do some voices become audible or inaudible? What are obstacles at play in terms of language, format, medium? So it's a question about regimes of audibility. And in order to pay attention to multiple voices and perspectives, but also to silence. How do we better equip ourselves? I wanted also to stress from the beginning that here we are using voice as a metaphor most of the time, but in some cases it's the literal embodied dimension we're interested in. So I think it makes a difference, and I hope in our discussion we can be as precise as we can about that. As an anthropologist with an interest in texts, oral and written, I approach discourse in general as multi-layered and dialogic. Nothing new and no specific to migration studies about that. But just to specify that when I'll be speaking about communities, I will have in mind not bounded groups, but spaces where discourse circulates. In some cases, across borders, in transnational spaces of discussion, and discourse circulates unevenly, depends on and reinforces often power relations. And this circulation of discourse is also possible because of shared assumptions. So part of what I'll be talking today will be about what's the common ground and what's lines of tensions. And at this point, I'd like to highlight two issues. The first one is about tropes, aphorisms, set phrases, clichés, which we can find crystallized in oral genres, such as proverbs and songs, but which are also much more commonly used as building blocks for ordinary conversations and narratives. As Abdelmalek Sayed has beautifully demonstrated for the migration space between Algeria and France, migration generates a wealth of discourse, stories, commentaries, including lies. In a way that's not specific to migration, but I do think that the experience of migration lends itself to generating very complex and convoluted discourses for both migrants and non-migrants. As for non-migrants, would-be migrants, people affected by migration, projections about the outside fuel dense and porous discursive fields, and here I borrow the notion of the outside to Alice Elliott, who conceptualizes it in her work on Morocco, where precisely she pays attention to imagination and the circulation of discourse. As for migrants, I'm sure it's a shared experience in this room. It's very common in conversations with them to feel that they're repeating things they have already said or heard. And I think we should consider the discourse of migrants as sedimenting both tropes from their societies of origin and those acquired during the journey and in the places where they live. The second issue is translation. So let me take as an example a very common proverb in the Mande-speaking areas of West Africa. So in Bambara, the proverb goes, Tungata Dambedon, and in Soninké, Tungata Dambetu. So my first point is that in those two languages, which are related, you have an exact translation, whereas obviously when it comes to translating it into French or English, it's much more difficult. Literally, it can be translated as migration knows no lineage, honor. And one of its interpretations is if you go to faraway land, you won't be able to rely on hierarchies based on your genealogy. People won't be able to place you. So it's both an advantage. You can take any job because no one will judge you. But it's also an admonition that the migrant needs to prove his own value, and it's a very male-centered perspective here. So as any proverb, it's polysemic, but its ambivalence makes it particularly powerful and apt to be brought in very distinct circumstances. Mamadou Diawara, who is a historian and anthropologist, has written a chapter where he challenges common translations of this proverb. Let me quote the title of his chapter: Seeing like scholars, whose exile, making a life at home and abroad. So he tackles the translation of the Soninké term of Tunga, which he suggests is best translated as adventure or migration, and not, as in some scholarly translation, as exile, which he finds far-fetched, especially when in local languages there is a distinction between mobility premised on return and more definitive departures, banishment. So I will leave it here, noting that this case opens up many questions and brings together ethnographic, linguistic, and epistemological challenges. Language is key to any project of paying attention to new voices. How migration is debated in multiple languages is central not only to understanding each setting in its singularity, but also to enrich our general understanding of migration.
Thank you, Aïssatou. So Anna, Carolina, same question, different answer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Professor Simon, for your presentation. I'm truly happy to be part of this incredible and inspiring event organized by IMISCO in partnership with Institut Convergence Migration. I must also highlight the work of the organizers who have put together a truly fantastic event. Marie-Caroline Yatminsky, my sincere congratulations to you and to your team. By the way, I'm very proud that my university, Unicamp, is the first Brazilian institution to join the IMISCO network. Brazil's inclusion in these networks embodies the very idea of decentralization. I would like also to thank Professor Adriana Nunes Ferreira, all her support in making this possible, and I must also extend my thanks to the IMISCO leadership and standing committee. Finally, I would like also to highlight the importance of the institution that welcomed us here, the Institut Convergence Migration, which is now undergoing an institutional restructuring. I'm really proud to be part of this institution, becoming an international fellow at the ECM, thanks to an invitation from Professor Michel Agier, though I won't thank him since he says I spent too much time on acknowledgements, has truly reshaped my academic journey. Inspired by the theme of this session, I will share a few brief reflections on the difficulty of making narratives from certain vulnerable communities resonate. The voices are not heard simply because we live under a policy of silencing. What is remembered and what is forgotten is a political decision. Even when certain individuals manage with great effort to make their voices heard, there is still a kind of global deafness. This happens because certain narratives do not reverberate through mainstream media, as those platforms do not allow them to. In addition to wars and armed conflicts, we are currently witnessing a war of narratives, not to mention the spread of fake news, which often aligns with extermination practices. We've never been so misinformed, ironically, in a world that is supposedly connected and globalized. In my view, our relentless historical trajectory, this false perception of progress, this belief that humans must dominate nature, and all of this urgently needs to be reconsidered and redefined in order to shift the current status quo. What we see and hear around the world is the result of narrative choices, and even in these barriers where to fall and everybody could hold their own narrative, would anyone be willing to truly listen? From the perspective proposed by this event, there is an urgent need to decentralize what has been assumed to be the center of the world. The unheard voices that named this plenary session are mainly those confined to zones defined by necro-diplomacy treaties. direct consequences of imperialist and colonialist governance. These are voices that dwell in the so-called peripheries of the world, and for this reason cannot even reach the margins of what is considered the epicenter of the planet. I ask myself, what is center and what is periphery if this sphere we call the Earth? Maps are abstractions, and their lines result from conflict, power struggles, and geopolitical choices. The writing of our world map is etched upon paths of corpus and marked by borders drawn in blood. Where do I speak from? I believe it is important to briefly share my own life cartography. I am Brazilian, and if it weren't the European colonial migrants and their mixing, I probably wouldn't exist. My sense of belonging is somewhat inverted. Following colonial narratives and their silencing, I learned that Brazil was discovered, despite evidence of human presence in America dating back 30,000 years. In school, I memorized heroic facts about Pedro Álvares Cabral arrival in savage lands, and those who invaded were credited with founding Brazil. The name of my country was chosen by the colonizer, a land once called Pindorama, which in Tupi language means land of the palm trees. Even our official language, Portuguese, is the result of colonial imposition over some 300 native languages, most of which are now extinct. If such a mistaken narrative still circulates, it's precisely because so many voices have been silenced by extermination, religious and cultural conversion, or being pushed to the margins of a so-called civilized society. The last 500 years of this continent country we call Brazil have been violent, shaped by colonization and slavery, a trauma is still largely silenced and whose consequences define Brazil today and many other countries shaped by colonial domination. How long does it take to erase all of this? Colonialism defines the narratives of our present time. Taking it even further, if we think of silence as a symbolic weapon, I recall the use of the silencing mask, an instrument used by European colonizers on enslaved peoples. It was a piece of metal placed between the tongue and jaw, tied around the head, and its purpose, as Grada Quilomba reminds us, was not only to prevent enslaved people from eating, but also to silence those who were it. I quote her, "Who can speak? What happens when they speak? And what are we allowed to speak about?" End of quote. This is the conceptual framework I want to put into perspective today. And I want to stress that it is this current world order that demands critical attention. Academia cannot remain neutral, sealed in a glass dome. We are privileged and we must act decisively so as not to reproduce the violence that surrounds us. How can we do that in practical terms? If we are powerless to change the devastating global governance, then we must implement inclusive policies to welcome people at risk. We must adopt equity policies in positions of hierarchy. Only then can unheard people make themselves heard, without us assuming a paternalist posture of giving the voice. Alongside this, we must also revise our structures of knowledge, which are still predominantly Eurocentric. And finally, I quote African-American poet and activist Audre Lorde in the book The Black Unicorn. "And when we speak, we are afraid. our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna Carolina. So, Sarah, what are your reaction to the title and your personal interpretation of it?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I will bring a kind of different perspective here, as mentioned before in my presentation. I work, I've been always working for a long time on the field of migration, but with a different perspective as a civil society actor. A lot in the field, and now in Brussels, in the EU bubble, in the making process, the policy making process. So I think, and of course, I've been, as mentioned in the first presentation, working and collaborating a lot with the researcher, and I think there is a lot of bridge and nexus and potential collaboration also to be increased. And I think it's very important also to have this kind of different perspective and how we can create a synergy, which is the role of someone. The title is advocacy director, is to bring the inert voice to the institution to try to influence the policy making process. And why that is very important? Because the reality we are observing in the at least 30 last year of EU policy making process in the field of migration, very similar conclusion also in the US migration policy, is that those policies are not rooted at all in the reality. Those policies are built in an electoral perspective, national, domestic electoral perspective. In any case, there is a kind of process to take into consideration the impact of those policies and the people that will be the most affected, the migrant community, refugee community, the most vulnerable people. So bring those voices to the institution is more key. I'll give you an example, which is the main indicator that finally drives the policy-making process, the number. Is the number of arrival. Last year, we observed a decrease of arrival in the Central Med, and that's why it was a reason for why we always hear the European Commission keeping saying, no matter if we are doing some deals with Malaysia and Libya, no matter, that's not important that we are legitimizing an authoritarian regime in Tunisia and a leader, a president in Tunisia who clearly did hate speech and legitimized racial violence. We are keeping doing this kind of memorandum of understanding. We are keeping doing externalization policy because the only criteria, the only indicator in the number of arrival. Since the number has decreased, so we will keep doing the same, and no matter if we violated the European values. Few days ago, I received a call from a journalist and say, how you can analyze the increase of arrival? Now there is, again, I mean, it's 25 years I'm working in a central manner. You see increase, decrease, blackmail approach, and that's based on the political deal between the two shores of the Mediterranean region. So now the number will increase a little bit from the Libyan shore arrival, departure. And what is interesting is that if you read a letter sent by the President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, she's sending to member states and she's saying clearly, my commissioner, DG Brunner, has to go to Libya and do the same deal on anti-smuggling, exactly keeping repeating, because there is an increase of departure. So the schizophrenia of EU policy on migration is that whatever is the number, it's always the number, the reason for why they justify to continue to do the same policy. And no matter if someone who is observing this policy in the last 30 years and the impact on the field, they are saying you are just repeating the same mistake. But that's the strategy. So I think that the key elements that we have to say here is because the people, they are mainly impacted by this policy, are totally not present in this policy-making process. So it's our role to bring those voices in the institution. I give you another example also how we try to work in a very sensible topics, very complicated topics that we are trying to be engaged since several years, is the question of missing migrants. In the question of missing migrants, it's really difficult to see the family of missing migrants engage in the policy-making process. There is no respect of the identification protocol, that's clear, is not respected in the north shore of the Mediterranean region, is even respected less in the south. But in any case, the horrible testimony of family have been missing their member family in the sea, looking for kind of proof they are still alive or not, to process the death of their family member, that's never taken into consideration when it comes to the policy-making process. I give you another example where it's very important to bring those voices into the policy-making process. Is the new file now in discussion in the European institution is return. We are doing a return, a reform or return, list of safe origin country, list of safe third country. In any case, did you never really seen a testimony of someone have been forced return to his country? No, because there is lack of monitoring mechanism. So in any case, member states are unable to know what happened after pushback or send back people. So I would like to provide this perspective because our role is exactly to try to bring those voices. But to do it, we have to be out from the Bruxelles bubble. So we have to be back to the field. It's where we can collect testimony because, of course, since most of the people are now, there are many of people stuck in the southern country of the Mediterranean region, in Libya, in Tunisia, and probably in the second round I will mention the challenges we are facing to collect this testimony. But what is key now here is to see how the academic world, the researcher can work together with civil society organizations. By the way, I think the good point is they're including more and more migrant community leaders in their daily work and also being represented by migrant community leaders, how to be able to collect those testimony, how to be able to make this voice be listened to the institution that somehow are the one in charge to define, to design the policy that then impact them on their daily life and impact them in a dramatic way sometimes. Because if we have to look at the number of deaths in Central Med is one of the region, I know more, but I would say also in Atlantic routes. This number is the consequences of those policies. So how is important to integrate those voices in the policy-making process, because the consequences of those is the dramatic impact in terms of human rights violation, international convention, but also, of course, the dramatic number of increase of deaths in the sea, in the desert, and all the migratory journey.
Thank you, Sara, for raising these voices, missing voices as well. So now the second sequence begins with your own personal research or activities or advocacy. How can you manage to make more visible or create sound from these missing voices or unheard voices? Aïssatou?
So in my research, I have been actively searching for spaces of enunciation where people debate migration and return. And actually, we have a whole panel devoted to this issue tomorrow, chaired by Stéphane Lecourant, in case you want to hear more about that. So my own work is in the region of Kai, in the west of Mali, to the border towards Senegal and Mauritania. And I've been looking into radio productions in vernacular languages at a time, the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, which precedes EU-funded deterrence programs. And turning my gaze at a past situation is a deliberate choice to avoid being trapped in presentist ways of approaching migration in this region. Looking into vernacular ways of debating migration, is also for me a way to question a kind of sometimes culturalist view of this region, where people tend to say, you know, people from this area have been migrating all the time, and it's part of their culture. And this, some anthropological concepts are actually very much circulating in common discourses. So I'll take two brief examples, one about women and one about men, as they, and my point is to go back to this idea of tropes, to begin with things that seems very stable and to try to show some tensions. So about women, their expression about migration is mostly found in songs, I mean popular songs, and some of them recorded for the radio. And I've been particularly intrigued by one motif, which was songs where women encouraged men to leave and actually severely mocked immobile men. Fatou Munkaila, working in Niger, has coined the phrase the non-migrant song for very similar material. So it seems like unequivocal. It's just, you know, if you want to be a man, just leave. And actually in the literature on sonic immigration, these songs are repeatedly quoted as, you know, evidence that there is a permanent culture of migration whereby young men would need to migrate in order to demonstrate their masculinity. But while listening at radio recorded versions of such songs in the 1980s, I found out that they did much more than reiterate a stable normative order around migration. And here when I say listening, it's like spending hours with my Soninke teacher, trying to understand the songs, also bringing them back in the field, trying to have them commented, etc., etc. In fact, some of the songs conveyed a harsh criticism of long-distance conjugality. And more generally, what they did was put forward female agency in male migration. Women performed their roles as judges of the success or failure of migration. Now, a few words on broadcasts, where men mostly discussed migration, again in vernacular languages. So they actually shared a lot publicly about migration. Before I've been quoting Abdelmalek Sayed, but I didn't encounter anything like what he described as a collective lie about migration. People were quite talkative. They spoke about the difficulties they encountered in France, about racism, difficulties in finding jobs, documents, questioned also the possibility of still going to France and the value of migration. So I bring these examples in the discussion as reminders that texts do not speak by themselves. Voices can be misheard, and by amplifying some voices, some utterances, we need to ask, was this a trope, a lieu commun, something you had to say and then, you know, after you could critique it, or how do people relate to this utterance? And here I am also speaking very literally, because I've been involved in a project to digitize these songs and put them online. So they are online, you can find them online, but until now they are not very easy to access. You need to go in the digital library and search for them. So we are also, together with the team of the radio, we are embarking on a project to promote this online collection, but we're also asking ourselves what it means to remediate sound archives from the 1980s, and typically if one would single out a version of the non-migrant song out of context, it would definitely not reflect the complexity of the discourse about migration in CAI today. So yes, I will leave it there, just saying that, you know, first, I mean, these examples also demonstrate that people whom we might assume are silent can be vulnerable in other spaces. So it's up to us to find where people talk, today probably in WhatsApp groups, in their languages. sometimes in community networks, but sometimes also in larger public spheres that we are, as researchers, may not be part of.
Thank you. So, invitation to go on the website to listen to the songs with a Sonic teacher as well. Okay. Anna Carolina, you want to elaborate on that?
Thank you so much. So my decision to work on the theme of forced displacement stemmed from the deep impact caused by a widely circulated image. The photograph of the Syrian boy Aylan Kurd, who drowned during a shipwreck off the coast of Turkey. That image traveled the world, revealing the powerful enunciative force of visual representation. It is shocking that 8 years later, or maybe 9 years later, this image was not enough to halt the structural causes that continue to force people into such dangerous journeys, nor to ensure safe crossings. Before and after Aylan, people continue to risk their lives in deadly migration routes. My main research focus is the analysis of audiovisual narratives about contemporary displacement, alongside reflections on memory and historiography, which are also the fields of my academic training. We are living through a challenging historical moment, one in which we are not only witnesses, but are urgently called to act. If there is one thing history teaches, is that the moments of crisis are turning points that compel us to rethink both our concepts and our actions. In the current collapse of the world order, we are not living in a historical internal awaiting discovery or revelation. With the exception of certain deliberated silence conflicts, particularly those on the African continent, today's catastrophes are being documented, some in real time, as in the case of the genocide in Gaza, due to the spread of information technologies. The present forces us to revisit the very concepts of history and memory, revealing how certain narratives are deliberately chosen to glorify specific pasts while erasing others. We tally, we chart, we calculate percentages. But what are these numbers for? The structural causes of forced displacement are not being addressed. Allow me to share a few figures. According to the latest report released by the United Nations Refugee Agency, we have reached a historical peak of 123.2 million people worldwide living in situations of forced displacement, 40% of whom are children. These individuals are fleeing political or religious persecution, armed conflict, violence, human rights violations, or other major disruptions of public life. They include refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, stateless people, and others in need of international protection. In global terms, 1 out of every 67 people is forcibly displaced. The report lists the countries with the largest displaced populations. At the top of the list is Sudan, a conflict largely ignored by the so-called center of the world, followed by Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. In Gaza, 9% of the population has been displaced, and a significant portion has been systematically exterminated. When I'm faced with the staggering rise of these figures, I recall Susan Sontag's observations that I quote: "The slaughter in war destroys what identifies peoples as individuals and even as human beings." End of quote. Returning briefly to my research object, my proposal is to analyze a film corpus dedicated to the theme of contemporary forced displacement, contributing to a reflection that pushes back against historical amnesia, against silence, invisibility, and the passivity in which much of society confronts this catastrophic condition. Even with the growth of audiovisual productions, some made by refugees themselves, these individuals are still silenced, invisible, or unreachable. To this, we must add the fact that refugee crises are not supported by any coherent memory policy. Some of the central questions that guide my analysis include: what kind of testimony are we dealing with when we consider this population spectrum? Who, in fact, is willing to listen to or see these accounts? What is the circulation of such narratives? How can these audiovisual productions be read as testimonies of what may be the greatest humanitarian tragedy in human history? My intention is to contribute to a rereading and a reframing of these films and documentaries, which in sounds and images I believe to be essential sources for researching and understanding the complex realities of forced displacement. Thank you so much.
So not only voices, but also visual about it, which is important as well. Sarah?
Yes, sorry, no, I was just a spoiler that I will also mention the visual dimension. As mentioned before, I have a kind of 25-year experience working on the field of migration, always try to analyze the impact of national and European policy on the ground, in the field, on people that are directly affected by those policy. And of course, what I've been observing in the last year is totally shrinking space and criminalization, increased criminalization of migration policy when it comes to the internal and external dimension. But I think what is really important also to point out is the increase of challenges we have been facing in these continued efforts to collecting testimony and bring the voice of people affected by those policies to institutions. The first challenge is, of course, the access to the field. I started working and crossing from Bamako to Niamey. I was going to the north in the border between Algeria and Mali. I had access in the north of Niger, in the border between Libya and Niger. That's totally impossible right now. First of all, for security reasons, but also for the increase of violence against migrant refugees in this area. The second huge challenges we are facing in these efforts on collecting testimony is the increase of the tension in borders, of course, but all in the migration journey. And that would be even worse if we look at the new proposal of the Pact of Migration. There would be an increase of number of detention places. I remember the time I was in Lampedusa, I could access directly to migrants. Now there is a barrier. You can go to Lampedusa, even not see migrants, because migrants are very, very fast, bring to the board and bring to the detention center. And even the access to these detention centers became more and more difficult and more challenging. There is a process of precarization of migrants, kind of way to do a dissuasion to arrive to Europe, putting migrants in the most vulnerable place and situation, and that is what has been called encampment in internal borders. But that's also became more difficult to speak with migrants, to collect their testimony, but also to work with them in terms of proposing a new way of thinking the migration. Can you imagine to go to what was Calais jungle in the past, that by the way have been destroyed several times, and then to try to speak with the migrants, we try to cross the border from Calais to England. Now there is even not a camp where people have to just find a place to survive. So the precarization somehow the lack of integration and reception policy, because the reality right now, even I'm back to policy, but that's my field, when we see the discussion around migration in Brussels, they are only focused on how to accelerate return and how to prevent arrival. That's the only main two topics discussed. We totally forget the work of reception, integration, and that of course has a clear impact on the ground. The clear impact on the way you can directly work with the migrant and refugee and migrant leaders community. There is a huge difference to speak with the migrants that try to construct a new life and to build a new life in a reception center and try to do that when in a very overcrowded camps in the south of Italy. When he's in Lesbos, in a detention closed camps that is supposed to be an open camps. So again, I think that somehow EU policy and national policy are impact also in the way we can work directly with migrants, because they are creating more and more barrier. And they have, of course, making their life a nightmare. I just wanted to end on the way in which I try always to deal with all these amount of very, very hard testimony to hear. There are people who have been crossing the desert, seeing their family or friends dying in the sea. I've been beaten. I've been living in camps. So how to deal with this testimony, but also how to deal with this silence? Because sometimes the stories are so horrible. There is only silence. So the way I've been trying to report back again to the institution, again to the policymaker, they have the direct responsibility of those policy and their impact. It's been through picture. It's been to social, what is called somehow the visual sociology. And there is a kind of way to see picture as a way to describe the reality. And sometimes when I was in a detention camp in Libya, speaking with someone who has been tortured, the only way to report back the reality he was explained to me is to take a picture and to show those pictures in the institution to policymakers, to media, to people. Sometimes the picture, and you have been mentioned, of course, the island one, speak more than thousands of words. And I think that for people who deal every day with all this story, picture have been a very important, very strong way to share testimony and to try to change things. This has not always happened, has changed, the dissemination of the picture of Ireland, and then policy has restarted as before, but I think it's a way also to report the way in which we see the reality in the field.
Yeah, so Sarah, you mentioned some challenges. I would invite the others as well to reflect on a few words on the challenges and the perspective and the more positive way to take on board these unheard voices and to find ways to make them more audible somehow. Aïssatou?
So just one street across from the campus, if you go up north after the last building where some of us had panels in the north, you just cross the street and you find a facility where over 300 men who have migrated from Mali, Mauritania and Senegal at some point in their life live. Some have been living here since the opening of these migrant hostels in 1970. And these inhabitants have witnessed all kinds of urban renewal projects, including the building of this campus. And it is one of the 150 foyers de travailleurs migrants, so migrant hostels, which France has inherited from a colonial system of hosting male labor migrants. So I won't have the time for history of this very typically French system of housing, but clearly the foyer, the history of the foyer tells a story of the tightening of borders. They host many newcomers informally, so they also reflect the much more violent border regimes, which Sara and Anna Carolina have been speaking about. And so we have a campus, and next we have such a foyer, and many of us on campus have been working with migrants. And I will tell the story basically in a few minutes of how we haven't yet made a proper connection. So my two concluding remarks is that first, obviously there are political conditions for having voices heard. Migrants in these specific places are vocal. They demonstrate. They literally have their voices heard through microphones. They hail the authorities. They claim urban status. But very often they are not heard, and they are silenced by oppressive urban and migration policies combined. Some of them still are better heard than others. Some have been routinely interviewed by journalists, scholars, etc. Some are bored when they are interviewed. They say that have been seen too many people of us, like scholars, journalists, etc. And the other question is obviously among these communities, who gets to speak? And as I think we all know, if we practice this, the quest for unheard voices can result in the same people being endlessly brought to the fore while others remain in the background. So, second question, do they want to amplify their voices? In some other cases, we scholars have been successful in creating bridges with communities of foyer residents. And sometimes it was artistic projects, documentary forms, film festivals, exhibitions. And in some cases, for instance, we managed to align our research interest with their own interest, especially in terms of mobilization, where typically if we bring some archival documents about their past urban history, sometimes the status of pioneers in some areas, it's useful for them. So yes, this raises the question of the moment where we engage that work and the opportunity for our interlocutors, and also about format. We've been speaking about visual methods. It needs to be something that they themselves can also engage with. But in the case of the nearby foyer, we have tried to create ties with the campus over the years. We arrived here as a campus in 2019, but this mostly materializes for the moment with people from the campus going to have a cheap lunch in their restaurants. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not a proper engagement. There, and you can have lunch. A very cheap, just cheap. And over there. There have been other initiatives, but which have remained quite limited until recently. We have invited them to film projections, etc. It didn't really work. However, recently we had a meeting here with an association working with them, and they said that they considered that we're very nice facilities, and that maybe we could organize something so they could use some of the rooms where we are presently have our panels to hold their meetings, and the administration of the campus is not against that, so maybe we will have the possibility to build something around that. But clearly from now, they're not looking at the campus as a space where they could make their voices heard. And myself, I would definitely not like this foyer to become a mere reservoir for new projects. I think in these kind of collaborations, we really need to think of the kind of bargain which is there. Over the years, as we get to better know our neighbors, there might have avenues of collaborations. But what I would like to emphasize is the fact that we cannot take for granted that we have anything to bring to people, that they need us to have their voices heard. And I will concur with Sarah. I think that our first task is definitely to listen.
Thank you. So, reciprocity at minimum. Anna Carolina, a few words about challenges and perspective.
Yeah, well, I will be brief and to the point. And Simone, forgive me, but I'm not able to be positive, as you mentioned before. The great challenge is to make visible, to bring to light, to express. Our team is urgent. At this very moment, civilians, including pregnant women, babies, children, adults, and the elderly, are being murdered, imprisoned, and massacred under justifications that are, at the very least, questionable. What shocks me most is the blindness and deafness of much of the world. From this perspective, I believe that images and sounds can be effective alternatives for breaking through the siege of exclusionary narratives. In my research path, I seek to engage the silenced narratives, and in that sense, I consider audiovisual media to be an essential tool for making the invisible visible and the unspeakable heard. Beyond that, films can function as sources, as evidence, and as narratives of denunciation. It was precisely through a film titled Quiet Life, a fiction based on real data that premiered at the Venice Film Festival last year, that I learned about the so-called resignation syndrome, a condition reported in Sweden that affects refugee children and adolescents whose families live in uncertainty regarding their asylum applications. In other words, is a diagnosis not caused by a virus, a gene, or bacteria, but rather by migration policy and bureaucracy. Our real world is comparable to a science fiction history. Children in deep sleep for months or years, as if the only possible protection were within the boundaries of their own bodies. The truth is that very few people know about this film and about the syndrome it portrays. The politics of invisibility and the silencing of undesirable narrative is in fact very effective. All that is left to us is the ethical and moral obligation to break through those boundaries. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. So, no positive words, but it's true that the world is dark. Sarah?
Yes, I will try to build from what Aïssatou also was mentioned in terms of avenue of collaboration, trying to be positive and providing a few very interesting examples of very constructive collaboration. One, it's a specific situation we have been following as a human rights in the border between Cyprus and Lebanon, where we seen back in 2021, 2022, seeing an increase of arrival by boats and systematic pushback by Cyprus authority to Lebanese territory and detain migrants, and then chain refuel to Syria that was under the control of Assad regime. I think that is very interesting case because there what we did is to activate our member on the ground found our Cyprus and Lebanese member, and that was quite great because also that was not so natural that they were working together. And of course, we engaged with Syrian community leaders and migrants community because they were able, the few one able to follow up what happened with the refugees sent back to Syria. And we fed a case to the European Court of Human Rights for illegal pushback. And that was only possible because we've been actively engaged with the researcher, Jill Halps, that is here in the room, and the colleagues that was there to collect the testimony and to keep daily for years the contact with the victim of those pushback. 5 years later, Cyprus have been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights for illegal pushback and child refoulement to Syria. And I think that's really, it's something we achieve all together. Local civil society, lawyer, researcher, human rights organization, asking for open infringement procedure against Cyprus to the European Commission. So I think that's the way forward in terms of collaboration. Also the way we have been working together with the researcher and policy analysts on the new pact to migration, try to look at the impact working with local civil society to see what could be the consequences of the implementation of those policies. So I think there are very good examples from where to start from. But I will also keep from your dark picture. I mean, we work every day on the situation in Palestine. We work every day on the increase of authoritarian regime all around the Mediterranean region. We all, every day working on the political shift in European institution. So I think that's a kind of also bringing together what you have been mentioned. Our role is to listen. Our role is to work together, all together, researcher, civil society organization, lawyer, to try to change those policies, because the impact is quite clear, but the change is more needed.
Thank you. So we reached the end of this plenary session. Thank you for 3 panelists, which has brought us very inspiring experiences and ideas about unheard voices. I guess you mentioned very clearly that we should make our policymakers accountable for the actions that they are doing and for the lack of actions that they are doing, both. And it applies also, there was a poster about Stop the Genocide in Gaza. It applies for the mixing deaths in the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic, and in the Channel, but it applies also for other places of murders. So thank you for all, and now we can go back to the usual activities.